So we're talking about Shimon Peres. I'll compare him a little bit with the two other people we're speaking about, Moshe Dayan and Arik Sharon. The big difference between Shimon Peres, who we see here, is that Dayan and Sharon were popular with the Israeli public. We can't say that about Shimon Peres. Quite an amazing story that I'm going to be speaking about today. And that is someone who in the big wide world is highly considered, a little bit like Abba Eban, two very similar characters in Israeli society, both of them well known in the big wide world, very intellectual, very successful in PR, but in both cases, not very impressive as far as the Israeli public is concerned. And we'll ask the question, why is that the case? So this is what we see. We see an early picture of Shimon Peres with his family. You can see the grandfather over there sitting down with the grandmother. Shimon Peres writes about his grandfather more than anyone else. The grandfather had a tremendous impact on him. The grandfather was religious, and it's interesting that Shimon Peres never appeared in Israeli society as being religious, but he clearly grew up with the religious family. And he writes in many of his works, we'll come later on to some of the things that Shimon Peres wrote, he writes that the grandfather gave him the most important Jewish values. And he said, you must never forget who you are. Unfortunately, the grandfather was killed in the Holocaust in one of those terrible events in Poland and put in a shack, and the shack was burned. We see Shimon in the middle, a nice little boy. By the way, when he was born, it was in Poland, and later the border changed, and it was called Belarus. And then on the other side, you can see Shimon with his brother. By the way, his brother never appears in any of the sources. I was trying to find out exactly what happened to him, just somehow not on Shimon's wavelength. So these are the two little villages, same village, by the way. One was when it was in Poland, the other that after the Second World War, Poland was moved about 150 kilometers to the west, so probably know the changing borders. You see there's a memorial stone for the Jews in the later Belarus were killed. And then when Shimon Peres was 80, they went to the family house, the little family house that you see there, and they put up a plaque. It's hard to read it, but it basically says this is where the family lived. Shimon was there, and they gave him a little certificate or something like that. By the way, he never had a great love of the people of Eastern Europe. At the age of 11, he came to Israel. By the way, he came and he was by himself for 2 years. Very interesting, Shimon Peres. He was always sort of out of his social environment. That means he says of himself before he came to Israel that he really was an oddbod. He really didn't get on well with the other kids. But what happened to him when he came to Israel, although he was alone for 2 years, 11-year-old, what he says of himself at that stage was that the 3 years that he was the Ben Shemen youth village were the best years of his life. He said it was absolutely wonderful. He said he learned about Zionism. He learned about the history of the Jewish people. He even got a little bit of basic military training. There's a Haganah program for young Israelis at school when they learn a little bit of basic military training. And it was really a good time for him, and he was very happy. We're going to speak about Peres's happiness, by the way, times when he was happy and times when he wasn't happy. His life wasn't easy, but maybe that's the choice that you find yourself in when you're a politician. Then comes one of the difficult issues. 1945, he marries Sonia, a woman a few years younger than him, my first and only love. By the way, he said this all through his life, although it wasn't such a great relationship. We'll see that a little bit later. As he gets older, he becomes very political, very, very busy. And what Sonia really wanted all her life was to live on a kibbutz. She didn't like the political environment at all. And although this was his first and only love, which he said until his dying day, by the way, that it wasn't such a great situation. Here we find the family. Sylvia, the girl on the side, that daughter, she became a professor at a college, Bedbarrel College. Then there's Yoni, who's sitting next to Sylvia and Shimon. And Yoni later became a director of a veterinary center. Then we find the baby. The baby is Nehemiah, who became a venture capital director. What's very, very clear about Shimon Peres, by the way, it's true of all the early Israeli leaders, very modest. They lived in a tiny little 3-room apartment. Every now and again, other family members were living there as well. If we look at David Ben Gurion, and we look at Levi Eshkol, we look at Golda Meir, and we look at many of the others, Menachem Begin certainly, very, very modest people, didn't expect that in their lives they would have much more than a basic salary. Things change later on in Israeli society. So here he's at the Kibbutz Alomot. I hope you can see it. I'm sorry that they're getting in your way there. He was in charge of the sheep. He got there in 1941 in charge of the sheep. And he said something very interesting. He was an interesting person, Shimon Peres. By the way, of all the many, many leaders that I've studied over the years, I've been in this business about 50 years now, studying leaders of different kind. Shimon Peres is really very interesting because he writes a lot and he says a lot about himself. And here he says about the sheep, I had to know their fears as if they were my own. Kind of interesting concept. He just wasn't looking after the sheep. He was doing a lot more. By the way, he said that living on the kibbutz was very difficult. And life generally, we know, even it was 1941, the kibbutz movement started in 1909, but even till then, it was not an easy kind of environment. Here he becomes a Secretary General of the youth movement. Youth movements in Israel then, and by the way, true until today, are very powerful. They have Israeli Scouts, they have Nora Oved, they have Bnei Akiva, they have Beitar, all the various youth movements, very, very central to the development of Israeli society. And what we find about Shimon Peres at that age is that Ben Gurion got to know him. And Ben Gurion was very, very astute in terms of getting people to work for him. He had a lot of young people around him, and that's what we're seeing over in the picture over there. And as Shimon Peres says about David Ben Gurion, he was not just a man, but a legend. And that kind of comment, by the way, you'd often hear from the people who were called the Young Guard. There were about 6 or 7 well-known Israelis who were in the Young Guard. They called them the Young Turks at a certain time, using the Ottoman term. And what we see there is people like Peres, Teddy Kollek, the famous mayor of Jerusalem, Moshe Dayan, and 2 or 3 of the other well-known Israelis, all very, very much attached to Ben Gurion. He was a kind of a father figure for them. And certainly the Ben Gurion-Shimon Peres relationship was particularly good. Shimon had no real background. In fact, he never got to university. He hardly finished high school, never went to university. He studied at a night course for part of a year, had no degree of anything, but he was absolutely brilliant, an autodidact. He really got everything worked out by himself. And Ben Gurion took him into the Haganah, and this is something which worked against him. In the early days in Israel, and it's not true anymore, unless you were in the army, you were no one. That means the most important component of your CV, of your vitae, was what you'd done in the army. It was a good army unit was an Ivy League American equivalent. So Shimon Peres worked in the Haganah, but a non-military position, a civilian position, and he worked in the Red House, which is the headquarters of the Labour Party. And what we know about him working and why Ben Gurion was so attracted to him was that at that time, 1948, the State of Israel has been created. Ben Gurion was both Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. And he turned round to Shimon Peres, a young fellow at that time, and he said to him in one occasion, "We need 6 billion bullets. Find them." And Peres, you know, the very intellectual guy on one hand, actually managed to do those kind of things. And we would see as we go through the explanation that he was promoted essentially as a doer. He was a good manager, very, very creative, had excellent talents at finding people who could help Israel. And we must remember at that period of time, Israel was a non-entity essentially, but Shimon Peres was very, very good at getting things off the ground. And very tough years. The early years in Israel were horrendously difficult. At the age of 29, a youngster, between 1953 and 1959, which, by the way, incorporated the Sinai Campaign of 1956. He was Director General in the Ministry of Defense. And youngster, that's very young. What we do know about young Israel in the young stage was that people in their 20s and early 30s often had central positions in all different realms in the country. So Peres is there. We see him on the left, and Moshe Dayan it must have been just before he became chief of staff, I would imagine. And they've already been, the picture is related to some military purchases. I think they were dealing with airplanes at that time. Then he became Deputy Minister of Defense. But Ben Gurion was both Prime Minister and Defense Minister. We're talking about the 50s. Once again, Israel is a very vulnerable country at that time. And Peres is given a free hand. And in those 6 years, once again, very, very capable person. And he is best known for, by the way, and his later stage when he was president, it came back, that he was responsible for the Dimona Nuclear Center. Very, very complex project. The information came from France, but as today, the big powers in the world are very frightened when smaller countries or other countries receive nuclear capability. There wasn't any money, so Peres on the first level had to go and get donations. So he was a good fundraiser. Then he had to convince the French that the nuclear center was not for military means, but for civilian means. And he managed to convince them, which was very important. Then the American government, by the way, was very upset about it. They were very worried about it. And there were many, many stories about American planes flying over the nuclear center. And then the Israelis, and Peres in particular, would have to say it's all for civilian purposes and not for military purposes. By the way, I'm not an expert on the nuclear issues, but I do know that from an Israeli perspective, those who are in strategic studies are very happy that until today, we have the possibility of using nuclear power. Hopefully, we will never have to, but living in the Middle East, that's kind of a useful card to be able to play. It's a card to play that you hope you'll never have to use. In the 1960s, Ben Gurion fought with all his fellow colleagues. Everyone of his age he argued with. Levi Eshkol, Pinchas Sapir, you might not know the names, Golda Meir, you would know. David Ben Gurion, as he got older, became a very, very difficult person to work with. For about 10 or 15 years of his life, he was impossible, apparently. But he liked young people, and young people liked him. So he formed this party called Rafi, which was a break-off of the Labour Party. It failed. There was one election. It didn't do particularly well. It got 15 seats. And then together with Shimon Peres, they joined the Labour Party. Peres was responsible for building Rafi. That means he was an astute politician, and I think that's what we always have to say about him, but not popular. That means he had these two unusual traits. He then became at a later stage, as Minister of Defense, 1974 and 1977, Minister of Defense. Once again, interesting, because he didn't have a military background. It's a little bit like at the moment in Israel, we have both a Minister of Health and the top civil servant have no medical background. So it's not very, there's a lot of discussion about it in Israel today. So Shimon Peres was often blamed for not having had direct military experience, but he had an understanding of the military without having been in the army. So, I mean, that's what it was all about. One of his great successes was the Operation Entebbe. You might remember an Israeli plane was kidnapped, very problematic. It required a lot of cooperation with the Kenyan government to fly over Kenya, and it was very successful, a very popular one. Unfortunately, one or two people were killed, but by and large, it was successful. And that was certainly one of the important components that we understand about Peres. He was maybe even better at dealing with overseas people than Israelis. Strange, but that seems to have been what was often going to come up in his life. What did he do in his life? What were his ministerial positions? So the actual details are not so important, but just to give a sense: defense, absorption, transport and postal, information, defense again, prime minister, foreign affairs, finance minister, foreign affairs, prime minister, development of Negev and Galilee, and then the president. He, more than anyone else, by the way, Arik Sharon, who we spoke about last week, also had a number of different positions. But this is an unusual character, and apparently, so the experts who worked with him in various stages said he would go into a job and he had this amazing ability to learn about what the field was. That people have said that they don't understand how he actually did everything he did. He must have slept a very few hours at night. He was a very highly motivated person, never relaxed, always on the job, quite tense, by the way. And I say that from personal contact. I, on 3 different occasions, had close contact with Shimon Peres. Once sitting next to him at a wedding, and the other 2 occasions with small groups in his office in Tel Aviv. And he wasn't a relaxed person. It wasn't comfortable. He wasn't one of those people who you walk in the room and have that warmth. He was certainly no Clinton or someone like that. He was very, very tense, very direct. He would answer questions, by the way, only if he felt it was of value. I was once with an American group, about 5 or 6 of us, and people were asking a whole range of questions. So he said, ask me all the questions, and then he answered only the 2 or 3 that he thought were of any value. So he really wasn't concerned about what other people thought that they should know. He always felt that he knew what other people should know. Broad understanding of Israeli society, many, many realms, and we haven't even seen all of them, because we'll see as time went on, he went into some additional realms as well. For 2 years, he was prime minister. This was his only success at the polls. It says here, the only time he won a national election. He, as I said earlier, he didn't get to the people. And if my own limited experience with him on 3 occasions says anything, I think that's what most of the voters felt in Israel. Even with someone like Yitzhak Rabin, was a very quiet kind of person. Moshe Dayan was very restless kind of person. Arik Sharon was much, much more outgoing. But it seems to be that he just didn't get to the voters. He couldn't stand up in front of an audience when he even became prime minister, when he was given a public speech. He never really got enthusiastic about it. He didn't enthuse the audience. He was very knowledgeable. He spoke very clearly, always, by the way, with a Polish accent. He never got rid of his accent, even though he'd come to Israel as a young kid. But what is often forgotten in Israel, and historians, I think, should ask what is known and remembered as much as asking what isn't remembered. I find that what is not remembered in history one of the most interesting aspects. I think if we went around Israel today and even asked the old people, what do you remember Shimon Peres for? No one would remember what he did with the annual inflation. Israel had a massive annual inflation, 400%. Unbelievable. I remember it, by the way. We sold an apartment and bought another apartment. And when you made an agreement and you were having to pay off over a period of time, you would state in the agreement 10 a.m. And why would you say 10 a.m.? Because your money value would be different between 10 a.m. in the morning and 5 p.m. in the afternoon. So in a day, your shekel to dollar, for example, figure was going to change. It was terrible, absolutely horrendous. Peres did what was very unpopular, you can imagine. He cut down excess expenses within the government. He improved the income tax collection system, and he eventually brought it down after a horrendous period of about 10 years down to a very low inflation figure. The other thing that he did, by the way, which was not easy, was he was responsible for the main withdrawal from Lebanon. The first Lebanon war was in 1982, a very messy war. I mean, all wars are messy, but I remember very clearly how messy that particular war was, because it was so much involved with civilians. Israeli soldiers who were taught to be soldiers were having to deal with civilians all the time. And it was quite difficult to withdraw. And what actually happened, and this was due to Shimon Peres, he pulled back the forces. Slowly but surely, he pulled back the forces. There was an agreement made with some of the Lebanese militia groups. We don't have to go into the details now. And by 1985, Israel was only in control of a very narrow bit of land, just a little bit north of the Israeli border. That was, you would imagine that the Israeli society, because this wasn't a popular war, the Israeli society would be very grateful to him for having done that. But once again, in this strange world of some things are remembered and many aren't, Peres is not really remembered for this particular activity. As Minister of Foreign Affairs, under Rabin, we reached a new level of personal conflict. Very tragic, and I'll just go into this a little bit. It is certainly been described as the worst period of Shimon's life, Peres' life, although, on the other hand, it's almost the most successful. So let's try and see what happened here. Here you have two personalities, both of them very different. Yitzhak Rabin comes from a totally military background, a man of not many words. He didn't write a great deal. He wrote just a very minimal amount of writing. He had little patience for intellectuals. And he was very popular, a quiet person. People used to say that when Yitzhak Rabin came into a room, you would never have thought for a moment that he was prime minister. Just a personal comment. I was serving in Sinai in the reserves at that time, and I remember Rabin came down on a bus. It was a time that they were discussing the possibility of withdrawing from the Sinai sub-peninsula. So he came down on a bus, and I was there, and we saw the bus coming, so we wonder who's coming down to southern Sinai to see us. And Rabin got off the bus, and in a most amazing way, he just strolled over to a few of us, 3 or 4 of us were standing together, and he chatted. He chatted. If I hadn't known that he was prime minister, I would say, you know, where in Tel Aviv do you live? That was that kind of thing. Very quiet, very soft handshake, very understated. And that was Rabin. Peres was different. Peres wouldn't do that. He wouldn't just stroll along and have a chat with people. And he was intellectual. He was very wordy. So you have two people who actually had to cooperate with each other all the time. For years and years, they had to work together. They knew they needed each other. Itamar Rabinovich, who wrote an excellent biography on Rabin, described them as Siamese twins, that whatever happened, they couldn't get away from each other. And they were in terrible conflict. People who were somehow caught in the middle. I knew someone who was working in the office at one time, and I was told that whatever happened, whenever there was a discussion, and Peres and Rabin had to work out something, it was a situation of ongoing tension. It's a very awkward situation. You know, you would kind of say, well, Rabin is the prime minister and Peres is the foreign minister, but somehow or other they needed each other and they had to work to each other. But what happened? The first thing were the Oslo Accords. Now it's true, and I've said this always, the Oslo Accords failed for many reasons. But the idea of the Oslo Accords was very much Peres's idea, although later on many people said, well, Rabin was succeeded and did it because he was prime minister. The truth is that Peres did it. Peres was very sophisticated in subtle diplomacy. He had learned that when he was a youngster. He had learned that when he had been in contact with the French. So Peres really got this whole Oslo issue off the ground. He had an assistant, Yossi Beilin. Yossi Beilin, who was in the foreign ministry, took two academics who were sophisticated academics, one of whom a personal friend of mine, and slowly but surely the Oslo Accords started getting off the ground. Peres had to convince Rabin. Rabin was very, very suspicious, legitimately, by the way, because this was dealing with the Palestinians, this was dealing with Arafat. So slowly but surely, Peres had to convince Rabin. The combination of those two people was good until it came to writing the document. The first stage of the document was what is called Gaza Jericho Now. It's a 4-page document, which, to be honest, says almost nothing. Then a little later, I'll jump down to the bottom of the slide. In September 1995, it was Oslo 2. Oslo 2 is a gigantic book. It's a book like this. I had to read it because I was working with the army people at that time, explaining what these agreements were all about. I was very happy when the English edition came out. But Oslo 2 it's a document. It's not a treaty in the sense that you would imagine. It's the infinite relationships that would go on in the West Bank area, West Bank and Gaza. I can't tell you how detailed it is. Apparently, Peres could not deal with the details, but Rabin could. And Rabin at a certain time, who had no great love for Peres anyway, apparently got totally fed up with the Peres, because Peres had the ideas. Peres was the man of dreams. He could think big. And Rabin found himself not only having to run the country, but basically being responsible for the nitty-gritty of the Oslo Accords. In the end, it did get them the Nobel Prize. The other role that Peres had as foreign minister was the Israel-Jordan peace treaty. Just to remind us, this is we've signed 3 peace treaties. Israel signed 3 peace treaties. We signed the peace treaty with Egypt, which was actually done by Menachem Begin from the right wing. the Israel-Jordan Treaty, which was done essentially by Shimon Peres and very much with the support of Yitzhak Rabin. And then there was another treaty which totally failed, and that was with the Lebanese government. So we've forgotten the Lebanese government agreement because it fell through pretty quickly. But agreements in the Middle East are difficult things. And once again, you need subtle diplomacy. The Israel-Jordan Treaty was because of a relationship that Peres developed with King Hussein. King Hussein, who was the long-term king of Jordan, had already established a relationship with Peres. At a certain time, there was tension because some secret agreements were disclosed in a broader sense. But once again, very successful in negotiation. A realm that Israelis don't really appreciate. It's very interesting. Sophisticated country, but it's many people in Israel don't really understand the problematics of secret negotiations, and that's a pity. November the 4th, 1995, Rabin's assassination. And I want to read a little bit from Peres's autobiography, what he writes about the Rabin assassination. Remember, two people who were never, ever showed any likeness for each other. The picture is significant. Rabin's arm is up against Peres's back. Now, I want to tell you, there was a lot of backstabbing which had gone on for the years. I mean, there was a lot of backstabbing, never the warmth of that. But what Peres writes in his autobiography about that evening that Rabin was assassinated, I think was very sensitive. And I'll read it to you. Rabin was worried about the polls. It was just, there were going to be elections. Just to remind all of us, tremendous tension at that time. There'd been a demonstration in Jerusalem where Benjamin Netanyahu spoke, when there was a big picture of Rabin in a SS uniform. Some very, very tough stuff had gone on here. I won't say it was almost a civil war, but the level of tension was awful, absolutely awful. So Rabin was very worried about the polls and some dangers that might come about. I'll carry on with Peres's words. When he arrived at the square, which is now called Rabin Square, he was amazed. His eyes shone. He was beside himself. That was the happiest day in Rabin's life. And we're talking here about a mass demonstration in the main Tel Aviv square. Gigantic, gigantic demonstration. The Israeli population on the center left and the left had turned out to support him. And then he says something which one would hardly ever expect. We became friends that day. He suddenly showed me true friendship. For me, it was the day when we became closer than ever. Tough. The day when they really became friends, that moment we see them standing up. It was the evening of Shira Shalom, singing the song about the Song of Peace. That was the day, the tragic day, night when Rabin was assassinated. From that period on, for a short period, Peres was prime minister, not very successful. Benjamin Netanyahu was much more charismatic, and he was sort of not quite sure what he could do. He went for a little time with Arik Sharon. He left the Labour Party, which he'd been a member of all his life. He went to this new party called Kadima, the Forward Party, spent some time with Arik Sharon. As we know, Arik Sharon had a stroke, and that was pretty much the end of the Kadima party. But Peres's period as president, his period of president is described like 2007 to 2014, 7 years, as the greatest period of his life. Unbelievably successful. Firstly, he was at at about that time, a little bit earlier than that time, he was a world respected figure. So he's still in politics, but he was about to become president a few years later. Among the people who came to his birthday, Bill Clinton, Gorbachev, de Klerk, the South African Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, and many others, and masses of people came from all around the world. It was the who's who of the world, and it said from Austria to Angola they flew in. And this is Peres moving, although he's not yet president at that time, he's moving into a presidential mode. He's not dealing with the nitty-gritty of politics anymore. He's somehow above it. And then a few years later, between 2007-14, he does become president, an amazing president. Now, the Israeli president, as you well know, is very different from the American president. It's a figurehead person who can play an important role in certain situations. At the moment in Israel, by the way, because of the political crisis, Ruby Rivlin, the president, is playing a very important role in deciding who's going to form the government and how it's formed. But it's a hands-off kind of a position. Peres, during this period, was loved by the world. I mean, on every single level, loved by the world. He received the honorary knighthood from the Queen. His overseas donors opened the Peres Peace Center. It's an interesting center, by the way. It's not a museum. It's not sort of walk around kind of place, but it's a research center. They run a lot of educational programs there. It's an impressive place, a lovely building, a very expensive building as a result of world donors. And more than anything else, Peres tried to bring Israeli society together. It's a split society on so many levels, on ethnic levels, on religious levels, on economic levels. He tried extremely hard to bring people together. And I think looking back and having, as I said earlier, having been interested in this leadership issue for a long period, I think that that kind of leadership is somewhat lacking in the world. Leaders who bring groups together, don't divide groups, is obviously what we're somewhat lacking in the big wide world. His life, modest family apartment with 3 children I mentioned. He was something that I haven't spoken about yet, an innovator. He had an amazing scientific understanding. Now we must remember, he had never studied this. He did everything, whatever he learned, he just got interested in the topic and learned it by himself. He would go to factories, by the way. He had a tremendous memory. He would go to factories and he would learn about issues. I remember listening to a lecture of his once, and he gave a lecture in terms of scientific developments of Israel and how Israel could help the Middle East in scientific change. And if I didn't know it, I would have imagined he had a doctorate in science, some science realm. Very interesting person in terms of what he could learn. At the same time, we have to remember unhappy family life. His children, by the way, loved him, regardless of the fact that in the 1980s, Israeli society didn't see Sonia, his wife. She died some years before him. I think that what I've got there at the bottom is pretty much the story. Throughout his life, he was surrounded by sworn admirers, but also bitter adversaries. One of those leaders, maybe that's a sign of leadership, where you couldn't just be neutral about him. You had to be for or against. And I think that's what happened. By the way, in the handout that Ari, I think, sent to you, there's a nice piece by Colette Avital. And Colette worked with Shimon Peres in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She was an exceptionally good foreign office person. She was, for example, the ambassador in Portugal, and she was very creative, an unusual kind of person. She also once produced an excellent report on money that Holocaust survivors should receive from Israeli banks. So if you have a chance to read that handout, I think you'll get a very good idea of someone who worked closely with Peres and how she understood and explains this tremendous aura that he has in certain realms, but not in others. His worldview, very quickly, 3 sentences from a tremendous amount of writings. When Israel was weak, I worked to make her fierce. By the way, he was a hawk. He defined himself as a hawk who became a dove. Rabin was right-winger and then moved to sign an agreement with the Palestinians. Menachem Begin, a right-winger who then went to sign a peace treaty with the Egyptians. An interesting phenomenon. But once she was strong, once Israel was strong, I gave my life's effort for peace. And he really did. Israel was not born to rule over other people. He felt that keeping Israeli control over the Palestinians was not going to be good for the country. And then he said of leadership, we need a generation that sees leadership as a noble cause, defined not by personal ambition, but by morality and a call to service. These are who he was as the intellectual. 18 non-fiction and 14 fiction books. Now, this isn't someone who sits like I do now in my study for 8 hours a day. He was doing amazing things, and this is what he's produced. His books are very serious, well documented. No one knows, as far as I've been asking people, how he managed to do it. Just to give an interesting example, he was once interviewed on television, and the interviewer said, Mr. Peres, what books are you reading? What are the books on the table next to your bed? And he gave, and I can't remember the exact books, he gave 3 totally different books. He was reading poetry, and I think one of them was a science one, and one was a history one, if I remember correctly. Tremendous, tremendous ability, amazing perseverance, even as a 90-year-old, by the way, I heard that his guards, the president had 2 or 3 people guard him all the time. He would walk up the steps to his apartments quicker than they could. So there was always a issue of, you had to be very fit to be one of Peres's guards. Just amazing range, and here just a handful of the non-fiction books that he wrote about. The 2 best books are by Michael Bar-Zohar, a well-known Israeli historian. Just a small comment, I know that the clock is ticking. Mickey Bar-Zohar went to Peres and said, I'm prepared to write your biography, but you know that I disagree with you. Peres was left-winger, Mickey Bar-Zohar was right-winger. And Peres apparently said to Bar-Zohar, I want someone to write objectively about me, not someone who's just going to play my game. The last book that Peres wrote, No Room for Small Dreams, he completed it 3 months before he died. If any of you want a good, interesting, easy read to understand what this person felt and how he looked at the world, I don't think it's necessary to read all the books, but to look at this one is a wonderful read. I've recommended it many times. And just my very last slide, Peres is ranking in the Prime Minister Haaretz poll. I mentioned it before. I think it's good. I know many of the people who gave the grades. Where does Peres fit in the big society? He's number 5 out of 12. So the rating is interesting. Ben Gurion, Begin, some people say Haaretz is a leftist newspaper, which is true, but we can get a good sense of what's going on here. Where is Peres's strongest points? Economics, top of all prime ministers. Vision, high, 8.7 is the third. Foreign affairs, that's all his negotiations, 8.6, he was third. And certainly a man of courage. Thank you very much. Over to Ari.
Thank you. So with our remaining time, we will take some Q&A via the chat. People have already put questions there. and I'll try to summarize and ask those questions. But before we get there, my good friend Rabbi Charlie Savanor, I think, is still on the line. He tells me that one of Peres's last appearances in the United States was at Park Avenue Synagogue. So shout out to Park Avenue and Rabbi Charlie. Charlie also mentioned that whenever we do get to travel again overseas and go to Israel, we should definitely go to the Peres Center. I understand it's in Jaffa.
That's right, yeah. Yeah.
I heard
And
it was
they do
excellent.
serious stuff there, so it's a good place to go. Good people there, by the way, doing excellent research.
Eddie Kotkin noticed that I have a wardrobe change. Yes, I'm wearing my, modeling our second CSP 20th year hats. For those of you who are going to donate to CSP in our fundraiser, which starts in just a few weeks, you'll get some nice hats out of it, except for Charlie Savanor. He has to wear the old hats, but the rest of you will get the nice hats. And I hope you will support us. More information about how to support CSP will be coming up by email and by other modes. I promise I will not visit your front door. Other people have asked about programs coming up. How do you get onto our CSP list? Just email me and I'll add you to the list so you'll know about other programs that we have that are coming up. Questions that have come up. Can you say anything, Paul, about his relationship to the Mizrahi world? Because one of the comments was that he was not as favorable towards non-Ashkenazim in his policies.
Look, we have to be honest, pretty much all the way through from Ben Gurion over to Peres and maybe even a little bit later, the Ashkenazi leaders had very little understanding of the Mizrahim. It wasn't on their radar. They came from Europe. I mean, they were so European. Their environment was European. Many of them were Yiddish speakers. Now, there are those who say people like Peres hated the Mizrahim. I don't think so. I think what it is, they didn't understand them. The Europeans, by the way, must remember, Europeans in many parts of the world regard being European as the creme de la creme and look down on different other ethnic groups in the world. So I don't think it's hate. I think it's really a component of not understanding. The only one of the early leaders, relatively early leaders, who understood the Mizrahim was Begin, sorry. But Begin understood them because he was an outsider politically. He wasn't in the Labour Party. So he was looking for a voting clientele. So in the 1950s, Begin is going into the transit camps, which we'll be speaking about next week. But that's what I think it is. I think it's a lack of understanding. Golda Meir, for example, made some very awkward comments about the Black Panther organization. So that's what I say about the Ashkenazi leadership, lack of understanding. By the way, no one taught those topics in schools. When I arrived in 1967, I could hardly find a course at university that dealt with the Mizrahim.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the whole nuclear power program and what you know about how hard it was for Peres to get that program into Israel?
It was one of those situations which is even true to today. The French were not really interested in doing it. Now, the only way that Peres could do it was by personal relationships. And he was very sophisticated in understanding that within French politics, there were the different camps, different groups, different kind of leaders having different interests. And I can't remember the exact foreign minister of the particular time that he was dealing with. It might be Guy Mollet. I think he might have been foreign minister or prime minister at the time. Peres had this ability of speaking to people when he really needed them. By the way, Peres learned French by himself. So he was speaking to the French in French. And it was the slow process of kind of going back and forwards and saying, think about Israel, and it's really only for peace purposes, not for anything else. And then there was a money issue. He managed to get some big bucks. I'm not quite sure who it was and how it arrived there, but the French were also paid for it. So that's really what it was. It was this, what people have said about the nuclear issue was very much based on personal relationships. Not to, it wasn't a government-to-government phenomenon, because I do know that many people in the French government were totally against it. But Peres found, by the way, there was I think there was a foreign minister whose wife was Jewish, and Peres kind of played on that component as well.
When you get a chance, will you send me that Haaretz article, and I can share it with our group so they can read it?
But I'll send you the total page of all the grades. Yeah.
Okay. Jody asked, there's some gaps in the curriculum vitae that you put up for Peres of like, there's 10-year gaps, like 77 to 84 and 90 through 2006.
Yeah, 84 to?
1977 to 84, I believe, and then like 1990 through 2006. They're just gaps in.
So they're gaps, that's right, yeah. He was, it was, yeah, 95, you're right, 95 to 2006. He then he was involved in traveling around the world, giving lectures and stuff like that. By the way, some of his writing was then, but a lot of his writing was done quite a lot earlier. So, you know, I'm not quite sure exactly what he did, to be honest, what he did in those quiet years.
You know what? I'm sure it's in the biography you recommended, which may be one of the benefits for people who become supporters of CSP for next year, for our 20th year. Maybe we'll have a Paul Liptz recommends library, and different levels will get different books from that collection.
Good. Yeah,
okay?
Somewhere on the, I think it is No Place for Small Dreams or something. I think it is somewhere at the back there or in the front. Yeah.
What was Peres' relationship with the religious community, the Haredim?
Quite good, quite good. He didn't get into conflict with them by and large. I think the fact that he came from a religious home was useful. And we do know that he was, you know, remember in the early period, by the way, the religious parties, the National Religious Party was part of the Labour Party coalition. So, you know, he was around at the time in the days when relationships between the Labour Party and the religious people were good. So I think that was pretty much what it was. He did understand the political power of both the modern Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox. And as far as I know, I don't recall any major conflict with the religious groups.
Any last words about his family issues, his relationship with his wife? You had touched on it a bit, and his children.
Yeah. You know, trying to look at the totality of his life, I imagine he was working 18 hours a day on the short days. I mean, just to have achieved what he achieved. And what we know about Sonia, she loved the kibbutz. She was on the kibbutz alumot. That's what she really liked. She absolutely hated political life. Now, why did she hate the political life? The way that her husband was treated and how they spoke about him was absolutely awful. You know, politics is a tough business. And apparently for a long time she was unhappy. She certainly didn't, she was in the president's house for a little bit. She didn't like that. She didn't like appearing in public. And we see for quite a few years, even before she kind of left the public arena, at the public events when most people were taking their spouses, if they had a spouse, Sonia wasn't there. So Peres never wanted that to come up in open discussion. And by the way, what we know in his autobiography, in his last work, it's very carefully phrased that they didn't fight, but Sonia had her interest and he had his interest, and that's what it was all about. The fact that the children wrote some lovely things in the introduction, in the foreword of the book, says that not good relationships with Sonia, but apparently very, very good relationships with the three children.
Okay, thank you. Will you just say a few words about your upcoming series, three-part series starting on Sunday?
So the next series, these three have been very political. So the next three are very sociological and anthropological. So we're going to deal with two Mizrahi, two North African groups, Northern and Middle Eastern groups. The first group will be with the Iraqis. The Iraqi Jews basically come from Baghdad, and then there's a northern Iraqi Jewish group, the Kurds. So we'll speak, they came essentially in 1950-51. The second group that I'll be speaking about are the Moroccans. The Moroccans came from the mid-50s up to the early 60s, coming from a very different kind of structure. That's why I took two Middle Eastern groups, but from very different kind of structures. And just to end off the series, I'll speak about a group which you people are aware of, and that's the Americans who made Aliyah. By the way, very different kind of Americans have come to live in Israel. In the early period, the Americans who made Aliyah were labor Zionists, socialists, people who'd been in Habonim and maybe Young Judea and organizations like that. From 1967 onwards, a significant number of Americans who come to live in Israel are living in the territories, and they're religious, modern Orthodox.